Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me. My name is Chloe Swindler, and I am a senior in the College of Fine Arts as a trumpet performance major. And this research project that I did was on African American female instrumentalists. So I came to this project because I noticed a gap in my own knowledge around this time last year. I noticed I couldn't name a single Black woman who played an instrument, who was involved in classical music, involved in jazz music at a high professional level. And that to me stood out as existing as a problem for one of three ways. It was either that they didn't exist, there were no Black women playing instruments in jazz or classical music, or there were no women who were playing at a high level of performance, or the third option, which is what I really came to find, in that they were performing at these high levels yet still left out of the narrative of a large part of jazz and classical history. So for this research question, my project focused on what contributions have been made to society and have been made to music by specific African American female instrumentalists from around the 1880s to today. And I traced it to the 1880s because there were several books published in the 1880s about Black female accomplishments. And in part of these, they had whole sections on musicians, and they broke down into categories, and none of these included female instrumentalists. So that's sort of how I was able to trace that back to that time. So the first woman who was the benchmark was Harriet Gibbs Marshall, who graduated in the late 1880s as the first woman to receive a degree for music. And so for this layout, for this research project, I used two different methods. One was text-based research, which was an interesting process with my advisor, Jean Jarrett. And the second part was interviews with contemporary performing artists. So I was able to break down this project into different sections to focus on. It was very difficult at first because I didn't know if I wanted to just do biographies of these women or just do sort of an overall, history, just one long shot. And so I came to find that there were specific differences between jazz and classical music that arose. So the categories that I was able to split this into were the first in classical, so about the 1880s to around the 1970s, and then the first in jazz, which I attribute to around the 1900s to 1970s, partially because of blues music starting around the 1900s and the tradition of Black women being involved as vocalists in blues music, so attributing some of the factors of their participation into that to around the 1970s, breaking barriers in classical music. So it wasn't until until around the 1970s that Black women who were not pianists were a part of classical music, who weren't pianists and string players. So we see a sort of variety of instrumentation as well towards the 70s and onwards. And even that barrier being broken here in Boston with Ann Hobson Pilot, who was the former harpist for the Boston Symphony Orchestra. She was one of the first Black women to sit in an orchestra in the 70s. So it really has taken a while to get to this point. The next section being representation in jazz in the late 20th century. And finally, what does the future look like? That's sort of the remarks that that we heard earlier. We're sort of trying to plug into the future. What is happening? What does the future look like for us and for creating more diversity and encouraging diversity in music? So all of this is exploring topics of representation in music, education, where did they come from, where did they go? Socioeconomic status. Most of these women were middle class or upper middle class, which we're seeing sort of shift in now because more women are being involved in high levels of performing music due to scholarships created for it. Class, lasting impact, and gender politics. So it intersects with all of these areas. So these interviews with contemporary artists were the second component after sort of figuring out, what categories I wanted to focus on. And so these interviews, one was with Velvet Brown, who's a tuba professor at the Penn State School of Music, and the second was with Terry Lynn Carrington, who is a jazz drum professor at Berkeley. So I just want to go over some of the texts that I did use for this project. So I just remember the first meeting I had with my advisor. We sort of sat down, typed into Google African American female instrumentalists, and nothing really came up. There's no text, there's nothing substantial written on them. They were all sort of scattered narratives and nothing was very cohesive. So we started with this one text from Spirituals to Symphonies. So he had suggested, why don't we start with composers? Those people usually have been involved in music either as singers or instrumentalists. They're going to have a background. They're going to have been involved in this. So we started there, and so that became sort of the small scope area of study. And this was a very eye-opening time for me because I didn't know anything about the history of Black people in music. That has not been included as a large part or any part truly of my curriculum. And so it was interesting to have to find your own way to that as well. And then the next text we looked at was Women and Music, which I thought in itself was an interesting title. Rather than Women in Music, I think the highlighting of women and music shows that it is a relationship where you can be in it, but also you feel very separated from it. So that was sort of the large scope of women's participation in music. And then the next three were really interesting texts. I found that I used The Black Musician in the White City, which was on race and music in Chicago in about the 1900s to the 60s and the Civil Rights Movement. This was what I sort of used as a case study to look at what was happening in Chicago in a predominantly Black and white area, and in an area where they were operating within these sort of segregated cultures and how Black people were still able to thrive with their music and societies despite that. And then the next book was also incredibly interesting on blues legacies and Black feminism. And this helped me to get sort of a context for what was happening in blues music and jazz music, which are often seen as sort of brother and sister genres. And with blues music, it was really that Black women were the foundation of it. They were the vocalists. They were the first people who really were the face of it. And they were usually working class women. They were usually very poor from very low socioeconomic areas. And so they were really the foundation of it. So what I found from this was these women, people like Gertrude Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, Billie Holiday, were able to sort of create that pathway that leads to what we have now, which is a larger contribution of Black women in jazz than compared to their colleagues in classical music. And then the last book is Stormy Weather, which is a collection of sort of biographies of women involved in jazz music. So these interviews were incredibly telling of what's going on in these genres today. So my first interview was with Velvet Brown, who's a tuba and euphonium professor at the Penn State School of Music, and she also is a member of the Stiletto Brass Quintet, which is an all-female brass quintet, and they wear red shoes. And so when I asked her about it, she had said, our only requirement is that you wear red shoes. We're not specifically an all-female group, which I thought was also an interesting point for her to make. And then the second interview was with Terry Lynn Carrington, who is a jazz drum professor at Berkeley. And she has 2 albums out, versions of the Mosaic Project. And these are all female instrumentalists and vocalists on these albums, which is truly remarkable. And for one of these albums, she won a Grammy Award for Best Instrumental Album. And that in itself, she was the first woman to receive that. And that's in around 2012. So it was still very late in the game for all of these things to be happening. So what I found from all of this, what I found from these interviews and from this text-based research is, the conclusion is that in classical music, there's a gender and racial barrier that is very significant. That leads to things like in my interview when I asked Velvet Brown sort of the questions getting to who do you know, what Black female instrumentalists do you know, we together could only name jazz musicians. So that in itself was telling, and that in my interview with Terry Lynn Carrington, she had said very little about people that she knew. When I asked her what Black female instrumentalists do you know, she said, well, Esperanza Spalding and Jerry Allen, that's research that you have to do on your own. So that in itself is a statement that there's so many people that she knows, there's so many people within the circles that she operates in, that there's no need to have to elaborate. So I think that highlights the difference in participation levels for both those fields of music. So in conclusion, I also found that the lack of knowledge of these women truly does stem from the omission of their narratives throughout music history. So the significance of this project, is to contextualize their research or their lives within this research. So this intersects with the studies of women's studies, African American studies, and music history as well. So thank you very much for your time. Are there any questions? Go ahead.
I guess in your interviews with Velvet Brown and Terry Lynn Carrington, did they feel that they themselves had experienced any discrimination in the industry?
So it was interesting because for Terry Lynn Carrington, who's involved in jazz, she had said she had never experienced that. She had said she had had male and female mentors. She never had to operate within these sort of social circles that, involved just women or black women. Whereas for Velvet Brown, it was sort of an interesting, different story in that she helped to create the International Women's Brass Conference because she found that even, in the late 80s and 90s, women were getting to the last round of classical auditions with the screens down. And they, should have been offered the job, and when the screen was lifted, they were not offered that. So she created this conference with the help of her colleagues to sort of have a stage where women could be guest performing artists and could be, soloists. And it's also open to men. They have male guest artists, they have male soloists as part of their competitions as well. But I think the most interesting thing was when Velvet Brown was talking about how she had gone here for her master's here at BU. And she had said that one of her colleagues, when she first got one of her teaching jobs, had said, you only got that because, you sort of fit that diversity card for them. And she said that the hard work that she put into her first recital that she had as the professor there showed she didn't have to say, I didn't get that because I'm a black woman. She showed that with her music. And so there are distinct differences between the two genres, and I think that really highlights the difference there. Yeah, great question. Sure.
In looking at what the future might look like for young musicians, did you come across any specific programs or initiatives that are in place to increase access?
Yeah, so some of them that I found, some were like the Sphinx organization, which is specifically geared towards African American and Latinx sort of generations, and targeting underrepresented groups within music. So there's groups like that are also doing programs in areas like Detroit and Flint to give free lessons to students in those areas. So sort of hitting it from the younger side of it all the way through an orchestra that's mostly composed of Latinx and African American instrumentalists. And then there's also different programs that are across the country that are just scholarships that sort of funnel these underrepresented groups into colleges. Like I know for the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, they have a partnership with a conservatory to do that for, again, underrepresented groups. So sort of both sides of it are being hit with young educators getting funding for it, as well as getting funding for higher level education. Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, thank you guys.